Welcome to the EMN podcast, where philosophy meets disaster and uncomfortable truths meet the profession we call emergency management. This is not safe space thinking. This is the arena. Let's begin. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are at in this fine world. And Andrew, people are going to start thinking that you're Dan Scott.
Yeah. I'll have to talk to him about that because he's a lot better looking than I am. So
I think
I
it's the
don't know if the beard quite fits the same length, but yeah.
So Dan, he's out there. I know he's listening, and hopefully he's traveling safe. Man, I tell you something. With everything that's going on in the world today, it's wild. There's so much stuff going on. We were talking about it this morning. We had, stuff that's happening with ICE. We have the stuff that's happening over in the Middle East, in Iran. We have the stuff that's happening in Venezuela. A lot of stuff happening in the world, and it's like it makes you think. How do we keep this from impacting us locally? I'm planning for the World Cup. And, I'm looking at all the stuff that's happening with Iran and how is that going to impact what we do? And then locally here in LA yesterday, there was an anti-Iranian government protest or support, whichever way you want to look at it. And in the midst of that, somebody drove a U-Haul through the middle of it, and so all these world events are starting to have impact on us locally. And it's we got to keep our head on the swivel and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I know it is challenging, and as we were talking about a little earlier this morning, that Cynefin framework that was put out by David Snowden under DARPA is, I think, a good sort of framework, so to speak. And I know we're going to be doing some work in writing on that, but understanding, how you adjust and respond effectively given, a complicated, extremely complex to chaotic environment, so to speak.
Yeah. And you know what? And this kind of goes into my piece I wrote on Sunday, talking about leaders don't really shape individuals, right? This is from what I mean by that is, yes, you can mentor and stuff like this, but you need to shape the environment to allow your people to strive, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the most important part about it. And going into what you're just talking about with the framework and then with stuff that's happening in the world, really today is when you have to be doing a double check on your, and for me at least, this is the way I lead at least, is checking on your people, seeing how they're doing, where are they at in the headspace. You don't know what people's connections are. You have people that work for you that might have connections back to Iran or in Venezuela, or maybe these things like this. And so these are world events may also impact your individual employees. And so this is where talking about shaping the environment for you to be able to thrive, there's a lot of steps that go into that, and that's part of it.
Yeah, and I think that if we think about this in terms of psychological safety, it is an operational requirement, right? It's not a sentimental need. Oh, well, we talk about it, but we need to have a sense of understanding, I think, as you put it, how is this impacting people? Where are they coming from? And the level of anxiety that they have. And also, I think, being vulnerable and sharing when that is relevant and appropriate. Not that you're going to do that on a regular basis, but I think just being honest with people. Here's a situation. I know this is serious. This is impacting you. And also, if people are not ready to share, understanding that as well. Mm-hmm. That some people may respond in a different way. They may just be sort of head forward. Let's just power through this. I'm not going to pay attention to what's on the left and right, but just focus on the mission. That's fine. However, we also just need to be aware of what's around us, what the environment is, both inside the office, inside the walls in which we work, as well as outside in the community with which we're working with different partners, different agencies, and so forth.
And that's critical right there. One of the things I do, especially when I know somebody's having, if I know people are having issues outside of the work, when I talk to them, I'll ask them. I said, where's your headspace right now? Are you able to hear what I am about to tell you? Because like two things. One is if it's really bad, you say, hey, it's time for you to take some vacation. You know what I mean? Just like step away from work, whatever, right? So there's that conversation. But the other side of it too is even if they're just having like a rough morning, like if, for instance, you're coming off the freeway, in LA, and you're just like frazzled, and somebody walked in my office and started like, telling me a bunch of stuff. I'm not ready to hear that at all. I need to be able to decompress a little bit. Go, okay, what's going on? And then go, okay, am I ready to hear what message needs to be there? So I know that for myself. Because there's been times when somebody comes in and starts talking to you, like, wait, what are we talking about? Because I'm not there. Can you catch me up? And so that's part of shaping that environment to allow your team to thrive. And oh my gosh, I just lost the name. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I'll pull it up. It was Simon Sinek's podcast, but he had the CEO or the former CEO of WD. What is it there? The WD-40, right? The spray.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. They had the CEO of that company on, and one of the things that he was talking about was creating that environment to where you can have open conversation with your employees, and when they are having that like bad time, is to pull Andrew over to the side and say, "Hey, Andrew, I noticed that you're having like a really rough day today. Like let's talk about that."
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because I want you to be in a place where you can perform at your top, right? And then sometimes even in creating that environment, a good environment for your team, is to know when we have to let go of people as well. And sometimes that's even better for the person, that they're not stuck in a job that they don't want to be in. You know what I mean? And so that's all part of that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're, as a boss, you kind of have to look at both sides of that, not just the performance, but is that person good for that team all the way around?
Yeah. And I think to your point on that is, when we look at, for example, after action reviews, we look at how is the system performing. We don't want to get into a situation where it's a blame game, so to speak, right away, right? It's a matter of what's not working. What are the contributing factors that are making this up? Not asking like who messed up on this, but what are the conditions that made this outcome likely? Oftentimes these are not independent variables or dependent variables of what's going on that's creating a situation that's happening, that's creating a certain outcome. And so that environment needs to be safe enough that we can have enough candor for conversations, and that people will basically not sand down the truth, not try to sugarcoat things, but be as honest and straightforward in a diplomatic way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the other side of it too, is it needs to be done in that diplomatic way. And then also being able as a boss to be able to receive that information back to you. And one of the books that I read a long time ago, and actually had the author on my earlier show, it's called "Turn the Ship Around" by L. David Marquet. He's a captain in the United States Navy, and it's an older book now, a few years old now, and it's kind of crazy how much time flies. And the interesting thing about the book, I highly recommend it if you have not read it, to read it. But the interesting thing about the book, or about David's take, was when he took over a ship, or the boat, like as they call it in the Navy, a submarine. He was giving these orders, and the team was saying "I," right? Like, I understand, I will comply. That's what "I" means, by the way. And then they didn't do anything, and he goes, what aren't you guys doing? And they turn around, they're like, sir, we don't know how to do that. Right. And he's just like, well, why did you say something? He goes, well, we thought maybe that you knew something more about the ship, the boat than we do, because, there's top secret information that, is only, and so basically what he was doing, he was trained he had himself all trained up and ready to go for a newer version of the boat, which had like basically say, going from third to fourth gear, where the boat that he was on only had third gear. Right, and so that really made him start thinking about like, wait, I need to be able to let my team talk to me, right, and not be afraid to interact with me, saying, hey, we can't do that, and this is why, or this doesn't make sense to me, and this is phenomenally a different approach than what the Navy's used to. And if you've ever seen the movie Master and Commander, that is truly what a captain of the ship is. He is everything, or she is everything on that ship, right? They are the judge, jury, executioner in some cases, right? When it comes to anything that occurs on that ship, right? And so, it's like talking back to, I don't know, the most high level person that you've ever dealt with. Whether so that's what I'm saying. So for him to go, oh wait, I need to be able to hear what my crew has to say, and then he takes it one step further. And so the military was, especially the Navy, is a may I world. May I do this, sir? May I do whatever, right? And waiting for that approval to be coming from the master and commander, from the top down. And so he shifted that concept into I intend to, right? I intend to do this, right? So I've already made a plan. I've already made ideas. I've already thought about what I need to do to get this task done, whatever it is, right? And going over to the boss saying, hey, this is what I'm doing. This is my plan for it, right? This is the steps I need to take. And then you just go, I intend to do this. And the only thing that he has to do as the master commander, as the boss, as the Navy captain, right, is to take a look at that to make sure that it's within the realms of what they're supposed to be doing, right? So now you're going, okay, I concur with that plan, carry on and do good,
yep.
Right? And again, that's another step that was different for the Navy. So he took this ship that truly was failing in the eyes of the Navy, right? Retention rate was low, performance was low, sea trials were low, right? Turned around to be one of the best boats in the Navy. So how did he do that? It was by creating the correct environment that allowed his individual sailors to thrive underneath his command. And that's really gets you thinking of like, how do we do that, in our jobs, right? How do we create an environment to where people can thrive? And that's what really got me thinking about this. Is why I wrote that piece. David has another book that just came out. And I was kind of chit-chatting with him, and it always got me thinking about it. Where I wrote this piece. Now we're here talking about it, but that's really the genesis of what this comes from. Is like, how do you create that environment? And I'll say one more thing, and I'll give it back over to you, Andrew. Is I think at the end of the day, it's putting people first. It's up to you. You can say what you want to say.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I reflected on a number of conversations I've had recently and on the experiences that I've had working both overseas in humanitarian work and domestically in emergency response. And one of the more recent conversations I had was around this idea of participatory management that I was introduced to well over 30 years ago. A colleague of mine, you come into a situation, whether it's internationally, whether it's nationally, in a community you may not be as familiar with, right? You may not be familiar with the culture. It may be a different language, whatever that is. And that language, so to speak, like my kids speak a different language than I grew up with in some ways. And I'm asking them, what do you mean by that when they say certain things? But coming in and having that level of intellectual curiosity around things, not coming up with that fixed mindset. When we're still moving from that mindset in emergency management from the old school to, let's say, the new school of that command and basically command and control situation, to one that's more of coordination, collaboration, and cooperation, or actually coordination, cooperation, collaboration is probably the better way to put it, so to speak. So from my own experience, when I worked overseas, I was a project manager. I was a project manager and emergency manager. I had a staff of about 12 people in the headquarters in Zagreb, Croatia. This is, again, just to give people, I don't want to go into a whole long story, but in the 90s, in a Civil War situation, and we're providing medical assistance, and we had 6 people working in the headquarters there. And at the beginning, I led all the meetings. At a certain point, I changed that after talking to somebody about participatory management, and I asked each person in my meeting, whoever they were, to actually lead the meeting. In fact, the person who was driving for me was this young man who started to learn English, and I said, "Hey, are you always going to be a driver? What is it that you want to do?" And he said, "Oh, this is what I'm interested in doing." I said, "Would you like to work in a different part? I can always find another driver, or we can figure that out." He went to work and actually became a member of the office staff. And at some point, he wound up leading a meeting later on. So I think, to me, first of all, you got to make sure people have the tools to be able to do that and are supported, and also that you're willing to allow them to make mistakes. So there has to be a fault-tolerant type of environment to support their learning and growth, and knowing that you're going to be there to help pick them up. And I remember one of my staff members pulling me aside and whispering to me, "But I'm afraid of making a mistake." I said, "You can't make a mistake. We can make a mistake. If we make a mistake, not that I want us intentionally to make a mistake, but don't worry about it. I will be there. I will be the safety net, and don't feel like you're not going to be punished. They're not going to be penalized. But we'll make sure that we're able to execute successfully together, because that's the way that we create a learning organization."
Yeah, absolutely. And that's critical too. That's a good point, Andrew. Is like, when we talk about creating that environment, again, is if we put it into the point of continuous learning, and that's when people strive. I saw this quote, and I'll take it for what it is, but it's one of those ones that says, "People don't leave organizations, they leave like bad environment." Kind of butchering a little bit, but that's the idea. In other words, like, if you had a good environment, people are less likely to leave. Now there's other reasons to leave too, for promotions and stuff like this, but the idea here, though, is like, I could tell you, I worked for this one organization, for a bit, and I had a bunch of years under it, and we had a change in leadership, and after the change in leadership, about a year into it, I was miserable there. I didn't. It was very backbiting. It got really super cliquey. Very, if you weren't in that particular group of people, it was. And I say cliquey, not cliquey like friends cliques. I mean, just getting stuff done. You know what I mean? Like, if you just, it was really bad. It was just like very bad environment. And when I put my resignation letter in, I didn't have a necessarily plan. I just knew I couldn't be there anymore. But the weight of that stress of being in that environment physically came off my shoulders. I was just like, felt lighter, and it was just, whoa, it was just crazy to know this. And then I went and got a job pretty quickly afterwards, and was in a great environment. It was awesome. It's great. And so realistically, I dreaded going to the shop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm guessing everybody's sort of been through something like that before.
Sure.
And the odd part about it was, like, after leaving there, the person who was the in charge of that department, he ended up getting fired for sexual harassment. And so it's like, whoa, you just like, did I made the right decision? You know what I mean? That's
that definitely demonstrates a very toxic environment. And one thing I'd want to build on is, when leadership is inelastic, then initiative isn't taken. Initiative by people below becomes very brittle, and people aren't able to make decisions. And I've seen those situations where, why didn't you make a decision? Why didn't you send the trigger to basically send out the alert? Why? Because I was afraid that the people above me either A, weren't going to listen, or they would hold me at fault for perhaps doing the wrong thing. And that is a problem. If you have a thunderstorm coming through, or you have a potential, earthquake that's going to make things worse, whatever that is, that alert that needs to go out, people need to feel a sense of empowerment that they have assessed the situation and done the right thing, and that they're going to be supported and not hung out to dry in those sorts of situations. And I think, we see, unfortunately, a lot of situations where emergency managers or folks under them, that leaders' intent is not clearly communicated, and that's not a shared decision. There's not an understanding is, what are the capabilities of emergency managers to be able to execute on this mission? We see a lot of resource constraints and issues that are there, and that sort of misunderstanding about command and control, and really what that, the command and control will break at some point if it does not actually include that coordination, cooperation, and collaboration aspect with the community. Because at some point we will exhaust ourselves. At some point we will burn out. We know that as emergency managers, whatever you're doing, whether it's inside an agency, whether it's inside a public health organization, whether it's inside a social service organization or housing association or whatever that is, or a corporation, we need to do that. It needs to go from just me to we doing that, and supporting that, and that decision making and resource seeking and partnership to actually carry out things. And a lot of that has to happen ahead of time. That seed laying work is a tremendous amount of leadership, and building those relationships ahead of time so that you can pick up the phone and be able to actually do things, as opposed to doing things all by yourself.
No, absolutely. And I think that's a critical step right there. What is your opinion on having that strong number two in your organization? Sometimes you're the number two. What's that? How do you feel? I think it goes back to the military, and I know I'm reflecting a lot of my military time, but kind of consider the fact that we're talking about a military book, or at least a book that was written by a captain. In the Navy, there's the CO and there's the XO, right? And then there's the chief engineer, and it's kind of those three people on that ship are it, right? If you've seen, you've all seen. Oh, not everybody's seen, but if anybody watched Star Trek, it's very, very similar. In that they very took a lot of stuff from the Navy way. All right, and so so you got the CO. Let's just talk about the CO and the XO. If the CO and the XO aren't on the same page, it's havoc throughout the ship. Throughout the organization, Navy, Marine Corps, same thing, CO, XO. So number one, you have to have a strong number two. But when you have a strong number two, how do you keep that person on the same page and not going rogue, if you will?
It reminds me of that movie Red Tide with Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington, which is a great movie to watch. Great acting, and just great dialogue and great scenes. And that is a prime example of that discord in terms of what do we do given this situation? High consequences, because they get, I think, the order to fire a nuclear missile.
That was a half order.
What's that?
The problem on that movie, just for everybody to let you know, an order comes in to shoot a nuclear missile, but it was a broken transmission.
Right.
So at the end, you weren't sure if it was an exercise or if it was real.
Yeah, that's that. Yes, exactly. I encourage people to watch the movie, because I think it's again a good example of this issue. To your point, though, to answer your question, I think that's where you need to have regular conversations with your junior people. And whenever I've stepped into a situation, whether it's as the lead or the second person, etc., is to have an ongoing conversation and a healthy relationship with that person so that we are on the same page. And I've always, my ethos has always been around, I need to be training the person who's next in line to take over my position. Every time I have left a position to go on to something else, I have always built the capabilities and coached that person to get to the point where, they should be able to take over. I remember I had a conversation at an interview with a candidate, and it stuck with me over the many years. It was one of the questions that I asked, and this is a common question: where do you see yourself in 5 years? And this person said, sitting exactly where you are. So they were indicating to me they wanted to replace me right from that first day. And we had a very good interview. And I thought, that's exactly the person I want working for me, because this person, definitely has the ambition, they have the drive, and that's what I would like to see. Now, I moved on to another country before that person then exceeded. I do remember, I think he did go up the ranks, a couple of levels after I had left. But it's that kind of idea. We shouldn't be thinking that we're going to be staying in that position forever. I see in some cases, there's a lot of turnover that's happening in the emergency management field in a lot of jurisdictions. But sometimes I see people just hanging on too long. They're in that organization and it becomes like a fiefdom as opposed to a very healthy learning organization. And when that happens, some reflection needs to happen as to whether this is a positive thing and that's sustainable long term, because oftentimes you'll see as a result of that a lot of turnover within the lower ranks. And that's not a very healthy thing for emergency management agencies. I know that that's not true of a lot of small jurisdictions, talking about counties, towns, small cities, so to speak, but definitely at the state and some large cities.
I think it's also at the, at some county as well, at that level. If you have stagnation and you don't have growth and you don't have a change of ideas, it doesn't. I'm not saying that people have to leave because of that, but if they get to the point to where they're not learning themselves, that's when you need to move out. That's why I really encourage everybody. Those who read my writings, most of the stuff that I'm writing about is because I'm intellectually curious about that. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason why I started writing, especially in the emergency management space and doing these podcasts, is because I'm intellectually curious about things, and I ask questions because I'm just like, a lot of times, sometimes I ask out of ignorance, and sometimes I ask the questions because I just really want to learn about people and what they're doing. And that's what really got me driving into what we're doing. And that's one of the things I encourage the people who work for me is saying, hey, keep asking questions, keep wanting to learn. We will put you into the position to where you can learn all the time, and whether it's through exercise training, whether it's through, having you write a memo, write an article, or teach a class, right? We do that here is where you go through and once a month, somebody in the group is teaching a different class, and that's really important for that, because number one, sometimes they hate it, they're like, oh, I don't want to do this, but what it does is it forces them to be intellectually curious because each class.
I think that's an important thing. It's also one of the reasons that I teach at the academic level. Actually, be starting a course this next week for teaching for Yeshiva University, and it's a class on disaster preparedness and crisis management, and just introducing people and then having to really wrestle with some of the existing challenges, right? And it's interesting because some of my students are working in situations where they're overseas, in places that some of them are up against or close to conflict zones. So, for example, in parts of Eastern Europe, where they're in that gray zone, so to speak, they are close to the war that's taking place in Ukraine. So they're dealing with the potential disruptions that are happening, in air traffic, transportation, systems, etc. Those are the realities of the situation.
Well, Andrew, we're at the end of our time, and it's always goes by fast when we're talking. I do really appreciate you stepping in again, and Dan will be back soon, and we're looking forward to seeing what he's been doing over the last couple of weeks. And again, I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, please stay safe and stay happy.
When the sirens scream out loud, or the voice that breaks the cloud, heads held high when things go wrong, will guide you through its strength and song. Disaster strikes without a sound, chaos reigns but we're around. Public safety in our hands, standing strong in every land. Emergency